I was getting dressed for what I thought would be a normal family dinner when my phone buzzed. The message from my son made my hands shake so badly I had to sit down. "You weren't invited tonight, Mom. Serena doesn't want you there." That's when I started remembering things differently. The quilt I spent months making that never made it out of their storage room. The $15,000 I lent them for emergencies that was never mentioned again. The holidays where my efforts went unnoticed. This story isn't just about one text. It's about waking up. That Tuesday evening started like any other, until my phone lit up with words that would shatter my world. I had picked out my green blouse, the one with the small floral pattern that Garrett once said looked nice on me. I ironed it carefully, making sure there were no wrinkles around the collar. At my age, these little details mattered more than they used to. I wanted to look put together for dinner at their house. I checked the clock on my kitchen wall. 5:30, plenty of time to finish getting ready and drive the 15 minutes to their place in Maple Heights. Garrett had called Sunday to confirm dinner would be at 7, the same time we'd been having family dinners for the past 3 years. Ever since they bought that house with the big dining room, we'd fallen into this routine. Every other Tuesday, I'd bring dessert and we'd catch up over Serena's cooking. I was reaching for my earrings when my phone buzzed on the dresser. The screen showed Garrett's name and I smiled. Maybe he was calling to ask what kind of dessert I was bringing. I'd made his favorite apple crisp that afternoon, letting it cool on the counter while the smell filled my kitchen. I picked up the phone and saw it wasn't a call at all. It was a text message. "You weren't invited to dinner tonight, Mom. Serena doesn't want you there." I read the words 3 times before they made any sense. My fingers felt numb holding the phone. I sat down hard on the edge of my bed, still staring at those words on the small screen. The green blouse suddenly felt too tight around my chest. I tried to take a deep breath, but it came out shaky and shallow. This had never happened before. Not once in all our years of family dinners had I been told to stay home. When James was sick, they came to our house instead. When little Emma had the flu, they postponed it until the next week. But they had never just excluded me. The words felt like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart with cold fingers. I looked around my bedroom, seeing everything differently somehow. The apple crisp cooling in the kitchen. The careful way I'd chosen my clothes. The small gift bag on my dresser with a book I'd found for Emma. All of it suddenly seemed foolish. I felt heat rising up my neck and into my cheeks, not from anger, but from embarrassment. How long had they been planning this? How long had Serena been wanting me gone? I read the message again, looking for some hint that it was a mistake or a joke. But the words stayed the same. Cold, direct, final. No explanation beyond, "Serena doesn't want you there." No apology, no suggestion of when I might be welcome again. Just the flat statement that I wasn't wanted tonight. My hands started to shake. I set the phone down on the bedspread and pressed my palms against my knees to steady them. I tried to think of what I might have done wrong. Had I said something at the last dinner? Made some comment that upset Serena? I replayed our conversations from 2 weeks ago, searching for any moment that might explain this sudden rejection. I remembered helping Emma with her math homework while Serena finished cooking. I remembered complimenting the new curtains in their living room. I remembered asking Garrett about his job interview, the one he'd been nervous about. Nothing seemed wrong that night. Everyone had been pleasant, normal. Or at least, I thought it had been normal. The silence in my bedroom felt heavy. I could hear the neighbor's dog barking outside and the hum of my refrigerator in the kitchen. These familiar sounds that usually comforted me now seemed to emphasize how alone I was. How alone I apparently had been without realizing it. I picked up the phone again and scrolled up through our previous messages. Garrett asking about holiday plans, me sending a photo of Emma's school project, normal family conversations that gave no hint of what was coming. But looking at them now, I noticed something. Most of our recent texts were about practical things, times, dates, logistics. When had we stopped sharing anything real? The apple crisp would go to waste now. I'd have to put it in the freezer or throw it away. The thought made my chest tight again. All that time spent peeling apples and mixing the topping, thinking about how Emma would smile when she saw it. How Garrett would ask for the recipe even though he'd never actually make it himself. I stood up slowly and walked to my dresser mirror. The woman looking back at me wore a nice green blouse and careful makeup, ready for a family dinner that would never happen. Her gray hair was neat, her jewelry modest but pretty. She looked like someone's mother, someone's grandmother. But apparently, she looked like someone who wasn't wanted at her own son's table. The message sat there on my phone like a stone in still water, creating ripples that would reach into corners of my life I hadn't even considered yet. This single text would become the key that unlocked years of buried realizations, forcing me to see patterns I'd been too loving or too afraid to notice before. 3 years ago, I spent 8 months creating something I thought would become a family treasure. The wedding quilt started as an idea in March, when Garrett announced he and Serena were engaged. I wanted to make them something special, something that would last longer than any store-bought gift. I pictured it draped over their bed or folded at the foot, something they'd use and love for decades. I drove to 3 different fabric stores before I found what I wanted. The base was cream-colored cotton, soft but sturdy enough to hold up over time. For the pattern pieces, I chose blues and greens that reminded me of the lake where Garrett learned to fish. I spent hours at my dining room table, cutting each square to the exact size. My hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but I took my time. Each piece had to be perfect. The pattern was called Wedding Ring, with interlocking circles that represented eternal love. I'd made quilts before, but never one this complicated. Each ring required 16 different fabric pieces, sewn together in a specific order. I worked on it every evening after dinner, sometimes until my eyes got too tired to see the small stitches clearly. James would watch television in the living room while I sat at the kitchen table, piecing together their future. I imagined Serena opening the box on their wedding day. I pictured her face when she realized how much work had gone into it. I thought about how they'd spread it on their bed that first night in their new apartment, how warm and secure they'd feel wrapped in something made just for them. I even imagined them years later, showing it to their children, explaining how Grandma had made it especially for their parents. The hand quilting took the longest. Every tiny stitch had to be even, pulling the 3 layers together into one solid piece. My fingers got sore from pushing the needle through all that fabric. I had to take breaks, flexing my hands and rubbing my joints. But I kept going because I wanted it to be beautiful. I wanted them to see how much I loved them both. I finished it 2 weeks before the wedding. The final step was adding the binding around the edges, which I did in a deep blue that matched Garrett's eyes. I folded it carefully in tissue paper and placed it in a white box with a bow. I wrote a card explaining the pattern and telling them I hoped it would keep them warm for many years to come. At the reception, I watched them open gifts at the head table. They smiled and held up kitchen appliances and picture frames for everyone to see. When they got to my box, Garrett pulled out the quilt and unfolded just a corner. He said, "Oh, a quilt from Mom," and handed it to Serena. She felt the fabric between her fingers and nodded politely. "It's very nice," she said. Then they set it aside and moved on to the next present. I told myself they were just overwhelmed with all the gifts. Weddings are busy, emotional days. They probably didn't have time to really look at it properly. I convinced myself they'd appreciate it more when they got home and could examine it closely, when they could see all the hours of work and love that went into every stitch. But weeks passed, then months. When I visited their new house, I looked for the quilt. I checked their bedroom, expecting to see it folded at the foot of their bed or draped over a chair. I didn't see it anywhere. I looked in their living room, thinking maybe they'd hung it on a wall like some people do with special quilts. Nothing. Finally, I asked Garrett about it. We were standing in their kitchen while Serena was upstairs with Emma. "How do you like the quilt I made you?" I said, trying to sound casual. He looked confused for a moment, then his face cleared. "Oh, right. The wedding quilt. It's in the closet upstairs. Serena wanted to keep it safe." That's what he called it when something was shoved into storage and forgotten. I nodded and smiled, but my chest felt tight. I thought about all those evenings at my kitchen table, all those careful stitches, all those dreams of it becoming part of their daily life. Instead, it was folded in a dark closet, no different from any old blanket. I tried to understand. Maybe they were saving it for special occasions. Maybe they thought it was too nice for everyday use. I made up reasons why keeping it hidden away was actually a sign of respect. But deep down, I knew better. They just didn't want it. My months of work, my careful selection of fabrics, my hopes for their future together, none of it mattered enough to them to find a place for it in their home. Looking back now, that quilt was the first real sign of something I didn't want to see. The pattern of taking my efforts for granted, of treating my love like something that didn't deserve acknowledgement. But it wasn't just about the quilt. This same casual dismissal would extend to much larger sacrifices I'd make for them. Financial help that would disappear without a thank you or any mention of paying it back. Hours of my time and energy that would be expected, not appreciated. The quilt incident was just the beginning of a much deeper problem I was finally starting to understand. The call came at 2 a.m., and like any mother, I didn't hesitate to answer. Garrett's voice sounded shaky on the other end. "Mom, I'm sorry to wake you up, but we have a problem. The transmission went out on Serena's car, and we don't have the money to fix it. She needs it to get to work tomorrow." I sat up in bed, still half asleep, but already thinking about solutions. "How much do you need?" I asked. He said the repair shop quoted them $2,800. I told him I'd transfer the money first thing in the morning. That's what mothers do. We help our children when they're in trouble. 3 weeks later, another call. This time it was medical bills from Emma's emergency room visit when she broke her wrist at soccer practice. Their insurance didn't cover everything, and they were facing a $3,200 bill they couldn't pay. Again, I didn't hesitate. I went to the bank that afternoon and had the money wired to their account. 6 months after that, Garrett lost his job when his company downsized. He called me crying, something I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. They had mortgage payments and Emma's school fees due. They were worried about losing the house. "How much do you need to get through this?" I asked. He said $4,000 would cover them for 2 months while he looked for new work. I looked at my retirement savings account on my computer screen. James and I had worked for 40 years to build that nest egg. We'd lived carefully, saved every extra dollar, planned for a comfortable retirement. But what good was money if I couldn't help my son when he needed it most? I authorized the transfer. The next emergency was their furnace dying in January. The repairman said it couldn't be fixed, and they needed a new one right away. Emma was getting sick from the cold house. Another $5,000 went from my account to theirs. I started buying generic groceries and skipping my weekly lunch with my friend Martha to make up for what I was spending. Each time, Garrett thanked me over the phone. He promised they'd pay me back as soon as things got better. "We'll never forget this, Mom," he'd say. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Those words made the sacrifice feel worth it. I was doing what good mothers do, protecting my family from hardship. But something strange happened after each crisis passed. The conversations about paying me back stopped. When Garrett found his new job, we talked about how relieved he was. But he never mentioned the money I'd lent them. When their tax refund came in, I heard about the vacation they were planning, but nothing about settling their debt to me. I started adding up the numbers in my head during quiet moments. The car repair, the medical bills, the mortgage help, the furnace. It came to over $15,000. That was a significant chunk of my retirement savings, money I'd counted on for my own future needs. I tried to bring it up once, carefully, when Garrett was helping me move some furniture. "You know, honey, when you get a chance, we should talk about those loans," I said. He looked confused for a moment. "What loans?" he asked. I felt my face get warm. "The money I've given you over the past year. For the emergencies." His expression cleared, but not in a good way. "Oh, that. Mom, I thought that was just you helping family. I didn't know you expected it back." I didn't know how to respond. Of course I was helping family, but help usually implied some kind of gratitude, some acknowledgement that a sacrifice had been made. I watched him struggle to move my heavy bookshelf, and I didn't bring up the money again. I told myself he was just overwhelmed with his own responsibilities. He'd remember eventually. But months passed, and it became clear that my financial help had been absorbed into their lives like water into dry ground. No mention, no acknowledgement, no plans for repayment. When I saw them buying new furniture for their living room, I felt a twist in my stomach. When Serena showed me photos from their weekend trip to the beach, I smiled and nodded, but inside I was calculating. That trip cost more than I'd spent on groceries in 3 months. I started feeling angry at unexpected moments. When Garrett complained about his job, I wanted to remind him that I'd kept him from losing his house. When Serena mentioned wanting to redecorate Emma's room, I thought about my own worn carpet that I couldn't afford to replace. These feelings scared me because I'd never been a bitter person. I'd always been the one who gave freely and felt good about it. I told myself this was just what family did for each other. I reminded myself that I was fortunate to be able to help them in their time of need. I pushed down the resentment and tried to focus on being grateful that they trusted me enough to call when they were in trouble. But the feelings kept coming back, especially when I had to say no to things I wanted because my savings account was so much smaller than it used to be. The $15,000 I'd given them represented years of careful saving and planning. But more than that, it represented a pattern I was starting to recognize. My generosity wasn't appreciated. It was expected. The money was just one part of a larger habit of taking me for granted, of treating my sacrifices as if they were simply what I owed them for being their mother. These financial sacrifices were matched by emotional ones that went equally unnoticed, creating a foundation of resentment that would eventually crack under the weight of my growing awareness. Every Thanksgiving, Christmas, and birthday, I told myself this year would be different. This year they'd notice the effort I put in. This year someone would say thank you without me having to fish for it. I'd start planning weeks ahead, making lists on the backs of envelopes, checking sales at 3 different grocery stores to stretch my budget far enough to make everything perfect. Thanksgiving was always the biggest production. I'd get up at 5 in the morning to put the turkey in the oven. 22 pounds, enough to feed everyone with plenty of leftovers. I'd peel potatoes until my hands were raw, mash them by hand because they tasted better that way. I made stuffing from scratch, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, dinner rolls, 3 different pies. The whole house would smell like butter and herbs and cinnamon. I'd set the dining room table with my good china, the set James and I got for our wedding. I'd iron the tablecloth, polish the silverware, arrange flowers from my garden in the center. I wanted everything to look nice when they walked in. I wanted them to see that this meal mattered to me, that they mattered to me. But somehow, every year, something went wrong. The turkey would be too dry, according to Serena. The potatoes needed more salt. The rolls were store-bought last year. Why didn't I make them from scratch this time? I'd stand in my kitchen, my back aching from being on my feet all day, listening to criticisms of food I'd spent hours preparing. Meanwhile, Serena would bring a bag of salad mix and get praised for thinking ahead. "Thank goodness you remembered the salad," Garrett would say. "Mom always forgets the vegetables." I wanted to point out the green beans and the sweet potato casserole, but I kept quiet. I told myself they were just trying to make Serena feel included. Christmas was worse. I'd spend weeks shopping for the perfect deal. Tea gifts, staying up late wrapping them with careful bows. I'd make cookies in 6 different varieties, enough to fill 3 large tins. I'd string lights around my porch and put up a tree, even though I was the only one who'd see it most of the time. I'd clean my house from top to bottom in case they decided to come over. Emma would tear through her gifts without reading the cards, moving on to the next present before she'd even looked properly at the first one. I'd watch her face, hoping to see some spark of excitement, some sign that she loved what I'd chosen for her. But she was always more interested in whatever expensive electronics Serena's parents had bought her. One Christmas, I spent 2 months knitting Emma a sweater in her favorite color, purple. I'd found a pattern with little flowers around the neckline, something special just for her. When she opened it, she held it up for a second, said, "Thanks, Grandma," and set it aside. Later, I saw Serena fold it and put it in a bag with things that were going to charity. "She has so many clothes," Serena explained when she caught me looking. "We're trying to teach her not to be materialistic." But materialistic didn't seem to apply to the expensive toys and gadgets Emma got from everyone else. Only my handmade gifts were considered too much, too old-fashioned, not worth keeping. I stopped knitting after that. What was the point of spending hours on something that would end up at Goodwill before New Year's? Birthdays were smaller but somehow more personal disappointments. I'd remember everyone's favorite cake, show up with homemade decorations, small gifts I'd put thought into. For Garrett's 40th, I made a photo album with pictures from his childhood, things I thought he'd want to share with Emma someday. He flipped through it quickly, said it was nice, then set it aside to open more impressive gifts from other people. I started keeping track, not on purpose, but because the pattern became impossible to ignore. Hours of cooking dismissed with complaints, gifts chosen with care treated as obligations, decorations and preparations taken for granted as if they happened by magic. Meanwhile, anything Serena contributed, no matter how small, received genuine appreciation and thanks. At Garrett's birthday last year, I brought his favorite chocolate cake, made from scratch like I'd done every year since he turned 5. Serena had picked up a small bouquet of flowers on her way over. Guess which one everyone talked about? "Serena, these flowers are beautiful. You have such good taste." The cake was eaten, but nobody mentioned who made it or how it tasted. I tried harder each year, hoping to break through whatever wall had grown up between us. I'd arrive earlier to help with setup. I'd stay later to clean up. I'd bring extra food so there would be plenty for everyone. But the harder I tried, the more invisible my efforts seemed to become. It was as if my contributions were expected background noise, while everyone else's were special occasions worthy of praise. The holidays stopped feeling like celebrations and started feeling like tests I kept failing. I'd lie awake afterward, replaying conversations, wondering what I could have done differently, how I could have earned the kind of appreciation I saw them give each other for much smaller gestures. I felt like I was performing in a play where everyone else had gotten different scripts. These holidays revealed a consistent pattern of emotional neglect I'd been too blind to see. My desperate need to create perfect family moments had made me accept treatment that would have hurt my feelings coming from strangers. Even my everyday presence in their lives followed this same painful pattern of being taken for granted while hoping for recognition that never came. Serena used to call me Mom, but somewhere along the way, that changed to Mrs. Peterson. I can't pinpoint the exact moment when it happened, but I remember the first time she used my formal name. We were standing in my kitchen and she asked if Mrs. Peterson needed help with the dishes. The words hit me like cold water. I looked at her face, searching for some sign that she'd noticed what she'd said, but she just kept drying the plate in her hands. In the beginning, things had been so different. When Garrett first brought her home, she seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. She'd ask about my garden, my quilting projects, stories about Garrett when he was little. She laughed at my jokes and helped clear the table without being asked. I remember thinking how lucky Garrett was to find someone so warm and considerate. The first real change I noticed was in her posture when I talked. She used to lean in, make eye contact, nod along with whatever story I was telling, but gradually she started crossing her arms more often. Her responses got shorter. When I'd tell her about something that happened in my week, she'd give me a polite smile and change the subject back to something about their life together. Phone calls became less frequent. At first, Serena would sometimes call me directly just to chat or ask for a recipe. We'd end up talking for 20 or 30 minutes about nothing important, just the easy conversation between women who liked each other. But those calls stopped coming. When I called their house, Serena would hand the phone to Garrett immediately, even if I'd asked specifically to speak with her. I tried to understand what I might have done wrong. I replayed conversations in my head, looking for moments where I might have offended her or overstepped some boundary I didn't know existed. Had I given unwanted advice about decorating their new house? Had I made some comment about Emma's behavior that seemed critical? I couldn't find anything obvious, which made it worse somehow. The visits became shorter and more awkward. Serena would check her phone frequently when I was talking. She'd find reasons to leave the room, checking on Emma, starting dinner early, folding laundry that could have waited. I felt like I was imposing on her time, even when they'd invited me over. The comfortable silences we used to share turned into uncomfortable ones, filled with the sound of me trying too hard to make conversation. I started bringing more gifts, thinking maybe I could win back her affection. I'd find little things at the store that reminded me of her. A candle in her favorite scent, a book by an author she'd mentioned liking. But even my gifts seemed to annoy her. She'd that and me politely, set them aside, and I'd never see them displayed in her house later. The worst part was watching how differently she treated other people. When her own mother visited, Serena's whole demeanor changed. She'd laugh freely, touch her mother's arm when they talked, ask genuine questions about her mother's life. I'd see the woman Serena used to be with me, warm and engaged, just not with me anymore. Garrett started taking her side in ways that confused me. If I mentioned feeling hurt by something Serena had said or done, he'd explain her perspective instead of acknowledging mine. "She's just tired from work," he'd say. Or, "You know how stressed she gets about Emma's school stuff." He always had a reason why I should understand and forgive, never a suggestion that maybe Serena could try harder too. I found myself walking on eggshells during family gatherings. I'd think carefully before speaking, trying to avoid topics that might make Serena uncomfortable. I'd watch her face for signs of irritation or boredom. I started leaving earlier than I wanted to, telling myself it was better to end the visit while things were still pleasant rather than risk saying something wrong. The exclusion from family decisions became more obvious over time. Plans would be made without consulting me, then presented as final decisions. Holiday schedules, vacation dates, Emma's birthday parties. I'd hear about them after everything was settled. When I'd ask why I wasn't included in the planning, Garrett would say they didn't want to bother me with the details. But it felt less like protection and more like being pushed out of the circle. I tried talking to Serena directly once, asking if I'd done something to upset her. She looked genuinely surprised and denied that anything was wrong. "I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Peterson," she said. "Everything's fine between us." But her use of my formal name, even during that conversation, told me everything I needed to know. We weren't fine. We hadn't been fine for a long time. The change happened so gradually that I kept hoping it was temporary. Maybe she was going through a difficult period at work. Maybe she was overwhelmed with motherhood. Maybe she just needed space and would warm up to me again eventually. I made excuses for her behavior because admitting the truth was too painful. The exclusion wasn't sudden at all. That text message telling me I wasn't welcome at dinner was just the final step in a process that had been happening for years. Serena had been creating distance between us slowly, methodically, until there was enough space to shut me out completely. And I had let it happen, making myself smaller and quieter, hoping that if I just tried hard enough, I could earn my way back into her good graces. This family dynamic was affecting my sense of self-worth in ways I was only beginning to understand. Sitting in that dress I'd never wear to dinner, something inside me finally snapped into focus. I looked down at my hands holding that phone, at the careful way I'd done my makeup, at the green blouse. I'd chosen specifically because Garrett once said it looked nice on me. Everything about that moment felt suddenly ridiculous. I was a 77-year-old woman sitting dressed up for a family dinner I'd been told I wasn't welcome at. That's when the memories started connecting in ways they never had before. The quilt folded away in their closet, the $15,000 that disappeared into their lives without a trace, the holidays where I cooked for hours and received nothing but complaints, Serena's slow retreat from warmth into cold politeness. All of it formed a picture I'd refused to see because seeing it meant admitting something I didn't want to be true. I had been enabling this treatment, not just allowing it, but actually teaching them that it was acceptable. Every time Garrett took my money without mentioning paying it back, I'd smiled and said, "Family helps family." Every time Serena criticized my cooking, I'd apologized and promised to do better next time. Every time they dismissed my gifts or ignored my efforts, I'd found excuses for their behavior and tried harder the next time. I stood up from my bed and walked to the mirror again. The woman looking back at me had spent years shrinking herself down to fit into smaller and smaller spaces in her own family. I'd accepted less appreciation, less consideration, less basic respect, telling myself it was because I loved them so much. But love wasn't supposed to make you disappear. Love wasn't supposed to hurt this much. The truth hit me like cold water. My unconditional love had become unconditional tolerance of disrespect. I'd been so afraid of losing them that I'd lost myself instead. Every boundary I'd failed to set, every time I'd swallowed hurt feelings to keep the peace, every excuse I'd made for their thoughtless behavior had taught them exactly how to treat me. I thought about the last time I'd been truly happy at a family gathering. I couldn't remember. Not because my memory was failing, but because it had been years since I'd felt genuinely welcomed and appreciated. I'd been performing the role of grateful mother and grandmother, thankful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. I'd convinced myself that being included at all was enough, even when that inclusion came with criticism and indifference. The phone still showed Garrett's message. I read it again, but this time I saw something different in those words. This wasn't just about one dinner. This was about years of me being treated like an obligation rather than a person they actually wanted in their lives. The text wasn't cruel because it was sudden. It was cruel because it was honest about how they'd been feeling for a long time. I sat back down on the bed, but not because I felt weak. I sat down because I needed to think clearly about what came next. This moment felt like waking up from a long dream where I'd been someone else. Someone who begged for scraps of affection from people who should have loved her freely. Someone who apologized for existing in her own family. I remembered my mother telling me once that you teach people how to treat you. At the time, I thought she was being harsh. But sitting there in my bedroom, I understood what she meant. I'd taught Garrett that my money was his whenever he needed it by giving it without question and never asking for it back. I'd taught Serena that my feelings didn't matter by accepting her coldness and trying harder to please her. I'd taught them both that my time and effort were worth nothing by letting them take it all for granted. The most painful part wasn't that they'd treated me badly. It was realizing how much I'd participated in my own diminishment. I'd been so desperate to maintain my role in their lives that I'd accepted a version of myself I barely recognized. The woman who used to stand up for herself, who used to expect respect, had been slowly worn away by my own need for approval. But there was something else in this realization. Something that felt almost like relief. If I'd taught them how to treat me, that meant I could teach them something different. If I'd been enabling this dynamic, I had the power to change it. For the first time in years, I felt like I had some control over my own life. I looked around my bedroom at all the things that belonged to me. My books, my pictures, my comfortable chair by the window. These were mine. This was my space, my life, my choice about how to spend my remaining years. I didn't have to spend them begging for consideration from people who'd already shown me exactly how much I meant to them. This text message became the mirror that showed me the truth about my family relationships. It forced me to see patterns I'd been too loving or too afraid to notice. The rejection hurt, but it also cleared away years of confusion about why I always felt so empty after spending time with them. This clarity demanded action, not just understanding. That night, I walked to my closet and pulled out the quilt they never wanted. It had been folded in a plastic storage bag on my top shelf for almost 3 years now. I carried it to my bedroom and spread it across my bed, smoothing out the wrinkles with my hands. The wedding ring pattern looked beautiful in the lamplight. The blues and greens still reminded me of the lake where Garrett learned to fish. All those hours of careful stitching, all that love I'd put into every square, deserved better than a dark closet. I stepped back and looked at it covering my bed. It belonged here, in a place where someone would see it every day and remember the hands that made it. The woman who spent 8 months choosing fabrics and piecing together those complicated rings. I felt something shift inside my chest, a small warmth I hadn't felt in years. This quilt was mine now. Not a rejected wedding gift, but something beautiful I'd made for my own home. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pen. I wrote carefully, using my best handwriting. Dear Garrett and Serena, I am writing to request repayment of the loans I have provided over the past 2 years. I listed each amount: the car repair, the medical bills, the mortgage help, the furnace replacement. $15,000 total. I wrote the date each loan was given and signed my name at the bottom. My hands shook a little as I folded the letter. This felt strange, treating my own son like someone who owed me money. But he did owe me money. I'd been treating their emergencies like gifts because I was afraid to ask for what was rightfully mine. I was afraid they'd think I was selfish or that I didn't trust them. But look where that fear had gotten me. I drove to their house and put the letter in their mailbox. I didn't knock on the door or call to explain. The letter said everything that needed saying. I'd given them $15,000 of my retirement savings. I wanted it back. Simple as that. That afternoon, I called my bank. I'd been automatically transferring $200 every month into an account I'd set up for family emergencies. money that always seemed to disappear whenever they had a problem. I told the woman on the phone to stop those transfers immediately. My money would stay in my account from now on, where I could decide how to spend it. I felt guilty as soon as I hung up the phone. What if they really needed help? What if Emma got sick or Garrett lost his job again? I reminded myself that other families managed these problems without calling their mothers for money. I'd raised Garrett to be independent, but then I'd spent years making him dependent on me instead. The guilt got worse when I thought about all the times I'd criticized other mothers for spoiling their adult children. I'd shaken my head at stories of parents who paid their grown kids' bills and wondered why they didn't teach them to be responsible. Now I realized I'd been doing the exact same thing, just calling it love instead of spoiling. But along with the guilt came something else. Relief. I looked at my checkbook and saw numbers that would stay there instead of disappearing into someone else's life. I thought about things I'd wanted but couldn't afford because my money was always going to their crises. A new winter coat, a small vacation to visit my sister in Florida. Simple pleasures I'd given up without even thinking about it. I walked through my house that evening, really looking at everything. The furniture that needed replacing, the carpet that was worn thin in spots, the kitchen cabinets that could use a fresh coat of paint. I'd been living like someone who didn't have any money while I gave mine away to people who took expensive vacations and bought new furniture. The hardest part wasn't the money or even the quilt. It was admitting how much I'd participated in my own neglect. I'd taught them that my feelings didn't matter by never expressing them. I'd taught them that my time wasn't valuable by always being available. I'd taught them that my money was theirs by giving it without question or expectation. Every time Garrett had taken my help for granted, I'd made it easier for him to do it again. Every time Serena had been cold to me, I'd responded by trying harder to please her. I'd been so afraid of losing their love that I'd accepted a cheap substitute instead of the real thing. These weren't acts of revenge. I wasn't trying to hurt them or punish them for hurting me. I was trying to remember who I used to be before I became so desperate for their approval. The woman who expected respect because she gave it. The woman who valued her own time and resources enough to protect them. By taking responsibility for enabling their behavior, I could finally change it. I couldn't control how they treated me, but I could control how I responded to that treatment. I could stop making their problems my problems. I could stop accepting crumbs and calling it love. These first steps opened the door to a completely different way of living, one where my needs mattered as much as anyone else's in my family. The next time my phone rang with their number, I let it go to voicemail. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching the phone buzz against the wood surface. The old me would have grabbed it before the second ring, worried that someone might be hurt or need something urgently. But I'd been learning to tell the difference between real emergencies and the kind of problems they usually called about. The voicemail was from Garrett. His voice sounded frustrated. "Mom, why aren't you answering your phone? Serena's car is making that noise again, and we need to know if you can help with the repair bill. Call me back." I listened to it twice, then deleted it. Their car problems weren't my emergencies anymore. The second call came 3 hours later. This time I answered, but I felt different holding the phone. More solid somehow. "Hi, Garrett," I said. "I got your message about the car." He sounded relieved to hear my voice. "Oh, good, Mom. We were worried something happened to you. So can you transfer maybe $3,000 to our account? The mechanic says it might be the engine this time." I took a breath. "I'm not able to help with that right now," I said. The words felt strange in my mouth, like speaking a foreign language. There was silence on the other end. "What do you mean you can't help?" he asked. I could hear the confusion in his voice. This wasn't how our conversations usually went. "I mean, I'm not going to pay for your car repairs anymore," I said. "You're adults. You can figure out how to handle your own expenses." More silence. Then Garrett's voice got that tone he used when Emma was being unreasonable. "Mom, we really need this car. Serena has to get to work." I thought family helped family. That phrase hit me like a slap. Family helps family. How many times had I used those exact words to justify giving them money I couldn't really afford? I looked around my kitchen at the chipped paint on the cabinets, the old refrigerator that made too much noise. "Family does help family," I said. "But that goes both ways. When's the last time you helped me with anything? He didn't have an answer for that. We talked for a few more minutes, but I could tell he was angry. He kept bringing up all the times I'd helped them before, as if that meant I owed them help forever. I felt my chest get tight, but I didn't change my mind. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, but not from weakness, from something that felt like strength. The next boundary came easier. Serena called 2 weeks later asking if I could babysit Emma for the weekend while they went to a wedding. I already have plans, I lied. I didn't have plans, but I could make some. I'd spent enough weekends taking care of Emma while they had fun without me. It was time for me to have some fun of my own. What kind of plans? Serena asked, like she couldn't believe I might have a life outside of being available for them. I said. I didn't owe her a detailed explanation of how I chose to spend my time. She was quiet for a moment, then said they'd have to find someone else. I'm sure you will, I said, and meant it. The hardest part wasn't saying no to them. It was dealing with the guilt that came after. I'd been taught that good mothers sacrifice everything for their children, that saying no to family was selfish. But I was learning that there's a difference between sacrifice and being taken advantage of. Sacrifice should be appreciated, acknowledged, reciprocated in some way. What I'd been doing was just enabling them to treat me badly. I started practicing with smaller things first. When Garrett called complaining about his job, I listened for 5 minutes instead of 30. When Serena made comments about my cooking, I said, I'm sorry you don't like it, instead of apologizing and promising to do better. When they made plans that involved me without asking first, I told them I'd have to check my schedule instead of automatically saying yes. Each time I set a boundary, they pushed back. Garrett would remind me of all the times they'd included me in their plans, as if being allowed to attend family dinners was a favor they did for me. Serena would get that hurt look on her face and talk about how she thought we were closer than this. Emma would pout and say I was being mean to her parents. But something strange happened as I kept saying no to things that didn't work for me. I started feeling better about myself. I had energy for things I actually wanted to do. I read books without feeling guilty about not being available for their calls. I took long walks without worrying that I was missing some crisis they needed me to solve. I realized that saying no to them meant saying yes to myself, yes to my own needs, my own time, my own peace of mind. For years, I'd been so afraid of disappointing them that I'd disappointed myself instead. I'd given away so much of my life trying to earn their love that I'd forgotten what it felt like to love myself. Each boundary I set made the next one easier, building my confidence like muscles getting stronger with exercise. I stopped apologizing for having opinions. I stopped making excuses for wanting to be treated with respect. I stopped pretending that their problems were more important than my well-being. This new strength opened possibilities I had never considered before. For the first time in years, I had a Saturday with no family obligations, and I didn't know what to do with myself. I woke up at 8 instead of 6, stayed in my pajamas until 10, made coffee without checking my phone for messages from Garrett. The silence in my house felt different somehow. Not empty, just quiet, peaceful. I sat at my kitchen table and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a whole day that belonged entirely to me. I walked around my house looking at things I'd forgotten were there. In the hall closet, I found my old watercolor paints pushed behind winter coats I never wore. The tubes were dried up, but I remembered how much I used to love painting. Before Garrett was born, I'd spend Sunday afternoons at the kitchen table with newspapers spread out, painting flowers from my garden. James would tease me about getting much paint on my fingers, but he'd always look over my shoulder and tell me they were beautiful. I drove to the art supply store that afternoon. The young man behind the counter helped me pick out new paints, brushes, watercolor paper. I felt foolish at first, like someone pretending to be an artist. But when I got home and set everything up at my kitchen table, something clicked back into place. My hands remembered how to hold the brush, how to mix colors, how to let the paint flow across wet paper. The first painting was terrible. The second one was worse. But I kept going because I wasn't painting for anyone else. I didn't have to worry about Serena making comments or Garrett asking why I was wasting money on art supplies. I was painting because I wanted to, because it made me feel like someone other than just mom and grandma. 2 weeks later, I saw a flyer at the grocery store for a watercolor class at the community center. I almost walked past it, then stopped and tore off one of the phone number tabs. The instructor was a woman named Helen, who was about my age. She had paint-stained fingers and wore bright scarves that made her look artistic. I liked her immediately. The other students were mostly women, all of us learning or relearning how to make something beautiful with our hands. Nobody asked about my family or why I was taking art classes at my age. We talked about color theory and brush techniques. We shared stories about paintings we'd seen in museums or books. For 3 hours every Wednesday, I was just Evelyn who painted, not Evelyn whose son didn't call her back. I joined a book club at the library. I'd always been a reader, but for years I'd only read books I thought might make good conversation with Serena, or something I could discuss with Emma. Now I read mysteries and romance novels and biographies of people I found interesting. The book club met at a coffee shop downtown, and we'd spend 2 hours talking about characters and plot twists like they mattered, which they did, to us. Martha, the woman who ran the book club, invited me to her garden club too. I'd let my own garden go after James died, telling myself I was too old to spend hours pulling weeds and planting bulbs. But working in Martha's community garden plot, my hands remembered what they'd known: how to test soil, when to water, which plants grew well together. My back ached afterward, but it was the good kind of ache that comes from using your body for something you enjoy. I realized how much of myself I'd lost trying to be the perfect mother and grandmother. I'd stopped painting because I thought I should spend that time cooking for family dinners. I'd quit reading novels because I thought I should be available for phone calls. I'd given up gardening because I thought I should save my energy for babysitting Emma. I'd shrunk my world down to just my role in their lives, and when that role got smaller, I nearly disappeared entirely. But now I was expanding again. I had opinions about books that had nothing to do with anyone else. I had paint under my fall, fingernails, and dirt on my clothes from working in the garden. I made plans that didn't revolve around other people's schedules. I bought groceries based on what I wanted to eat, not what would be good for family dinners. The women in my art class and book club became real friends. Not people I saw because we were related or because we were supposed to spend time together. These were women who chose to be around me because they enjoyed my company. We laughed about the same things. We complained about the same problems. They remembered what I'd told them the week before and asked follow-up questions. Making decisions based on my own preferences felt strange at first. What did I want for lunch? What color should I paint the guest bedroom? Which movie did I want to see? For years, these choices had been made by committee or not at all. Now I could decide things quickly, without consulting anyone or worrying about whether my choice would disappoint someone else. I started sleeping better. I woke up with things to look forward to instead of family obligations to fulfill. My house felt more like home because it reflected my interests, not just my role as the family matriarch. I hung my watercolor paintings on the walls. I filled my bookshelves with novels I actually wanted to read. By investing in myself, I discovered I was worthy of the love I had been giving others. I deserved friends who appreciated my company, hobbies that brought me joy, days that belonged to me. I'd spent so many years trying to earn love through sacrifice that I'd forgotten love should be freely given. This personal growth affected all my relationships in ways I was just beginning to understand. 3 weeks after I stopped answering their calls immediately, my son showed up at my door. I was in my kitchen washing brushes from my morning painting session when I heard the car pull up. Through the window, I saw Garrett getting out of his truck with that determined walk he'd had since he was a little boy when something wasn't going his way. I dried my hands slowly, taking my time. The old me would have rushed to open the door before he even knocked. When I finally answered, he looked surprised to see paint on my fingers. "Mom, what's going on with you? You're not answering your phone. You won't help us with the car. Serena says you hung up on her when she asked about babysitting." He pushed past me into the living room, looking around like he was seeing the place for the first time. His eyes stopped on my watercolor paintings hanging on the walls. "I've been busy," I said. "Would you like some coffee?" He shook his head and sat down in James's old chair without being invited. "Busy doing what? Playing with paint?" "Mom, we need to talk about this attitude you've been having lately." That word, attitude, made something twist in my stomach, like I was a teenager being scolded instead of his mother. I sat down across from him and folded my hands in my lap. "What attitude is that?" I asked. He gestured around the room, taking in the paintings and the new books stacked on my coffee table. This whole thing where you're pretending you don't care about family anymore, where you were too important to help us when we need it. The conversation went on for an hour. Garrett reminded me of every time they'd included me in their plans, like those invitations were gifts I should be grateful for. He talked about how hurt Serena was that I'd become so cold and distant. He mentioned how confused Emma was about why Grandma didn't want to spend time with her anymore. Each word was designed to make me feel guilty for putting my own needs first. But something had changed in me. I listened to his complaints without apologizing or making excuses. When he finished talking, I told him about the letter I'd sent requesting repayment of the loans. His face went white. "You can't be serious about that," he said. "That was family helping family. You can't just demand money back from your own son." "I can, and I am," I said. $15,000 is a lot of money for someone on a fixed income. I need it back. He argued that they'd never agreed to pay it back, that I'd given it freely. I reminded him that he'd called them loans when he asked for the money. We went in circles for another 20 minutes before he finally left, angrier than I'd seen him since he was a teenager. Serena tried a different approach. She called me crying 2 days later, saying she didn't understand why I was shutting them out. "I thought we were close," she said through her tears. "I thought you loved spending time with Emma." When that didn't work, she got angry. "Fine, be selfish then. But don't expect us to keep trying to include you if you're going to act like this." The guilt hit me hard after that call. I spent the rest of the day questioning whether I was being unreasonable. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe I should apologize and go back to the way things were. But then I looked at my paintings on the wall and remembered how good it felt to create something just for me. I thought about my book club friends who actually listened when I talked. Emma was the hardest. She called me directly, which she'd never done before. "Grandma, why won't you babysit me anymore? Did I do something wrong?" Her small voice almost broke my resolve. I explained that I loved her, but that I had other things to do now. She asked what things, and I told her about my art class and book club. "Those sound boring," she said. "I thought you liked playing with me better." For weeks, they kept testing my boundaries in different ways. Garrett would call with smaller requests, hoping I'd say yes to something easy and then gradually work back up to the bigger asks. Serena would mention my art supplies when she saw them, making comments about how expensive hobbies were for people on limited budgets. Emma would act extra sweet when she saw me, clearly coached to win me over. But I stayed consistent. Every time they pushed, I held firm. Every time they tried to guilt me back into old patterns, I reminded them that my boundaries were not suggestions. It was exhausting at first, like holding a door closed against strong wind. But gradually, something shifted. Garrett started calling less, frequently, but when he did call, he actually asked how I was doing instead of launching into his latest crisis. Serena stopped criticizing my choices and started making neutral comments about my new activities. Emma began telling me about her school projects without expecting me to drop everything and help. Not everything changed. They still didn't understand why I needed boundaries. They still thought I was being difficult for no good reason, but they were starting to accept that this was how things were going to be now. The family's reaction confirmed that my boundaries were necessary and overdue. Their shock at my refusal to be constantly available showed me just how much they'd been taking my support for granted. These changes rippled out into every aspect of my life in ways I was still discovering. 6 months later, I realized I hadn't thought about that terrible text message in weeks. I was sitting in my art class, mixing blue paint with a tiny bit of yellow to get just the right shade of green for the leaves I was painting. Helen was walking around the room, looking at everyone's work, making gentle suggestions. When she stopped at my easel, she smiled and said my painting reminded her of spring mornings in her grandmother's garden. I felt proud in a way I hadn't experienced in years. My Tuesday evenings looked completely different now. Instead of getting dressed for family dinners that left me feeling empty, I spent those nights at book club or working in Martha's community garden. Sometimes I just stayed home and painted, listening to music I actually liked instead of keeping the television on for background noise. The silence in my house felt comfortable now, not lonely. The relationship with Garrett remained complicated. He still called, but less often, and when he did, our conversations were shorter. He'd stopped asking for money after I made it clear the answer would always be no. Sometimes he sounded genuinely interested in what I was doing. He'd ask about my paintings or whether I'd read any good books lately. Other times, I could hear the frustration in his voice, like he was talking to a stranger who used to be his mother. Serena surprised me by showing up at my door one afternoon with Emma. She looked around at my paintings on the walls and the art supplies on my kitchen table. "I didn't know you were an artist," she said. I told her I wasn't really an artist, just someone who liked to paint. Emma picked up one of my brushes and asked if I could teach her how to make flowers like the ones in my pictures. For the first time in years, Serena didn't find a reason to cut the visit short. The women in my art class became real friends. We met for coffee after class sometimes, talking about our paintings and our lives. Carol had been married for 50 years to a man who never noticed when she got her hair done. Janet's daughter lived across the country and called once a month if Janet was lucky. Margaret's son was 45 and still asked her to do his laundry when he visited. We understood each other without having to explain why setting boundaries felt so difficult and so necessary. I started attracting different kinds of people into my life. The woman who ran the flower shop where I bought art supplies remembered my name and always set aside interesting seed packets she thought I might like. The librarian recommended books based on what I'd enjoyed before. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who I'd barely spoken to in 5 years, started waving when she saw me working in my garden and eventually came over to share cuttings from her roses. I learned to love myself with the same attention I'd once given to my family. I bought myself flowers for no special reason. I took long baths with expensive soap I'd found on sale. I made meals I actually wanted to eat instead of cooking what I thought others might prefer. I hung my favorite painting in the spot where I'd see it first thing every morning when I came into the kitchen. Other women started sharing their stories with me. At book club, during coffee after art class, in the grocery store checkout line. They told me about adult children who only called when they needed something, daughters-in-law who made them feel unwelcome in their own families. Years of putting everyone else first until they'd almost disappeared. My story gave them permission to examine their own lives, to ask whether they were being loved or just being used. The transformation hurt sometimes. I missed the version of myself who believed that unconditional love meant accepting any treatment. I missed the comfort of thinking that being needed was the same as being valued. But I couldn't go back to that woman, even if I wanted to. She'd been living in a house of cards that was bound to fall eventually. Emma started calling me directly sometimes, just to talk. She told me about school and her friends and a boy she thought was cute but annoying. These conversations felt different from our old interactions. She wasn't asking me to do anything for her or solve any problems. She just wanted to share her life with someone who listened without judgment. I realized this might be what a healthy relationship with family was supposed to feel like. My financial situation stabilized for the first time in years. Without the constant drain of their emergencies, I could plan for my own needs. I replaced my worn-out winter coat. I bought better art supplies. I put money aside for the Florida trip to see my sister that I'd been putting off for 3 years. Having control over my own resources felt like freedom I'd forgotten was possible. The painting I'd been working on in class was almost finished. It showed a small garden with flowers in full bloom, surrounded by a white fence that was sturdy but not too high. Helen said it looked like a place where someone could feel safe and happy. I looked at it and realized I'd painted exactly what my life felt like now. That devastating text message became the greatest gift my family ever gave me. It forced me to wake up to my own worth, to stop accepting scraps and calling them love. The rejection hurt, but it also cleared away years of confusion about why I always felt so empty after trying so hard to please them. My story continues to unfold with new possibilities every day, each one built on the foundation of finally choosing myself. Sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who force us to find our strength. That text message felt like the end of my world, but it was actually the beginning of my real life. I spent 77 years trying to earn love through sacrifice. I gave my time, my money, my energy to people who took it all for granted. If you recognize yourself in my story, know this. It's never too late to choose yourself. You deserve relationships built on mutual respect, not obligation. You deserve to be valued, not just needed. Start small, but start today.